Hey there and welcome to another little video of mine. My good friend has asked me to do a tutorial for this specific mermaid piece and especially on how I created the ocean effect. So here we go. I'm not going too much into the technicalities of it all, but some little fun facts before we start. My canvas for this illustration is 4,800 width with a 2,700 height, because that's the size of my portfolio PDF, which this piece serves as the last page for. The original intention was to use this as the cover illustration, but I prefer it as a last banger at the end instead. As for the brushes, I use mainly the basic Procreate brushes. Mainly the airbrush, linear paint, and 6B pencil, but probably some more, with these being my main go-tos. As well as the oil pastel brush by Loish and various cloud and foliage brushes by Devon L. Quartz. Both artists share their packs for free / a voluntary donation, and their brushes have been a staple in my own process basically since I started using Procreate. And another little fun fact, I don't really use the foliage brushes the same way Devon L. Quartz does in the demo videos she includes in the download, but that's fine by me. I prefer playing around myself first, but I also plan on following her video once in the future to see how the brushes work as originally intended. And yet another tool I use is the lasso tool, mainly for the first big shapes in the composition, instead of using a brush for that. It takes a while to get used to that approach of working, but man, now I really don't want to miss it. But now let's get into the creation process. First, I created the rough concept sketch for the illustration because I wanted and needed to have a concrete idea of what kind of reference I was looking for, before going to actually hunt for them. During the sketch phase, I discovered what I wanted the illustration to feel like, the color palette, the rough composition, and some smaller details I liked. That's what I always do when I'm working on a more involved piece, usually for a professional context. Because one, if I go into the research part with a plan, I don't get too influenced by other people's visions via their artworks or photos or whatever reference I find. And second, I don't get lost in the research trap as easily, where you spend hours upon hours looking for references to build a coherent picture instead of going in with a plan. For this specific illustration, I also did some alternative composition sketches. However, I already had a pretty good idea of what I wanted, so I didn't sketch as much as I usually do. But it's still important to do some brainstorming, because sometimes you discover a totally different, yet better idea than your original one. But not this time though, so let's get going. Once I got the sketch down, I went to look for references. My main focus for that were the colors and how to draw the ocean. For this, I collected many pictures out of my visual development art books, especially the Moana one, because the setting is very similar to the world of my own art piece. Many plants, a warm climate, many hues of blues and greens in the water, etc. But this book wasn't my only source, and so I collected a nice little mood board in PureRef. My other, arguably even bigger main reference was the anime movie Stranger by the Shore. I've been reading the manga since the first volume came out in Germany in January 2016, and I also saw the movie in the cinema. While I'm not as much of a fan as I used to be, I am a giant fan of the animation and especially the backgrounds in the movie. And they just happen to be very close to the vibes I imagined for my illustration. So the next step in my process was to look for screenshots that aligned with my vision and do color studies, but also pay attention to the level of detail the artists used and some other smaller aspects. If you want to see more of that process and what I learned, etc., please have a look at this video of mine, where I go over that in more detail. But the summary is, I watched the trailer and took screenshots, as well as go look for some on Google and Tumblr. With those, I created a mood board, where I grouped the pictures together and picked the most suitable ones to do studies of. I limited myself to 3 images so that I wouldn't fall into the study trap, where you learn all the time but don't create your own thing, and I think 3 images with the same theme but different executions were a good choice for that. Each screenshot has a different lesson for me, but overall I focused on the minimum level of detail needed, because I tend to overwork my pieces, and seeing a professional movie that also very much impressed me personally, and its quote-unquote lower level of detail, aka not overworked to death, really helped me with my own piece. Studying and recreating your reference is so much better than just looking at it. I know this looks like a lot of prep for one singular illustration, but like I said, I only do this for the ones that are more involved or where I want to challenge myself. Those are the circumstances I learned the most in. So now after I finish the piece, I have a rough guideline on how I can create another ocean piece, for example, without doing as much research. Also, it's simply a lot of fun. But now let's get into the actual illustration. After I did those speed studies and learned enough to go ahead with the actual piece, I started by blocking in rough shapes. But then I instantly got lost in the details of the mountains. But oh well. I threw some gradients and textures on there, and after I caught myself overworking them again, continued with the blocking in. And to be fair, the gradients were important for the overall color harmony, even though I did end up redoing the whole thing later on. And this is the part where I also have to admit that this was the second time I had to go with this illustration. Which is why sometimes you can see me trace over my first draft, but overall I'm still following my process of working from big objects to the smaller ones. With the occasional details like the floating hair, because I just felt like it, and who was gonna stop me? This illustration consists of two planes, the mermaid and ocean in the front, and the human house and mountains and foliage in the distance, which the mermaid is wistfully looking at. The third plane would be the ocean surface, which I wanted to visually set apart from the ocean below, as well as I could, while still having it all feel connected. Below the surface, it's way darker than it realistically should be at that level, and I visually hinted at the even greater depth further in the lower background. The water's surface is also more dynamic and moving, as indicated by the foam, in contrast to the seafloor, which is very calm. It might not be realistic, but it serves the visual storytelling of communicating the two different worlds, so to say. As for the sky, and especially the clouds, I tried to keep it less detailed overall or blurred certain parts, but used crisper edges around the mermaid's head and the house in hopes of leading the viewer's eye a little bit more. Not gonna lie, I had too much fun and over-rendered the clouds, but this level doesn't distract from the focal points of the head and the house, so it's fine. If anything, I overworked the foliage, but that's also fine. Perfect is the enemy of progress, and I know what to do better next time. Now for the ocean surface, I had done a rough gradient before, going from the dark blue in the front, over a lighter one, over to a pretty greenish color, and then the beach. But let's focus on the blues and greens. At this point, I stepped some hue variants on the surface and blended them based on my instinct. I really just went with vibes, but if you need some concrete advice, I'd say let the two main colors slowly bleed into each other, but keep some concrete edges to imply waves. Then, on the edges of those waves, I added the white sea foam. I'm analyzing my process a lot for this video, but honestly, the further I get into an illustration's progress, the less I think and the more I go with my guts. And over the years, I learned that this is the best process for me. Less overthinking and more feeling. But yeah, after I created the white caps on the waves, I moved on to the sun reflection. I got some splatter brushes, and I think I used the one included in Louise's pack, but you could also just draw some dots by hand and blend them. Anyways, I put the splatters down, erased and blended some areas so that it wasn't too distracting, and then added a very bright teal, which is kind of in the middle of the blue-green spectrum, to show the light reflecting on the ocean's surface. Afterwards, I added some more details to the part that get hit directly by the light and create a visual path from the mermaid to the house, the two focal points of my piece. Also, again, I was low-key just having fun and not thinking too much. I then added some more details to the back to unify the piece again. For example, I created the illusion of more houses in the distance to make the closer house feel a little bit more isolated. After rendering a bit of the distant seafloor and reworking some parts I felt needed, I moved on to the actual highlights of the piece, the foreground and the character. Here I added some colored line work, guided by the tight sketch, which was a pretty straightforward part of the process. I also created yet another visual plane by adding some leafy plants in the foreground and rendered the boulder the mermaid is leaning on. Again, a pretty intuitive and straightforward part, but some tips for that would be to remember your focus and only really render those parts. That's the reason why the plants in the very front have very little detail, even though that's what's closest to the viewer's POV. For the stone, I love putting highlights and dark outlines right next to each other where the light hits, but once again, my guide for that part are the vibes. Lastly, I put a dark blue overlay layer over the below the surface area and do the final rendering of the character. And with this, we're finished. Overall, I'm very happy with this piece, even though there are still many things I'd like to get better at. But my main focus of improvement was the ocean and honestly just creating an illustration with an actual background and a character existing in it. So I'm very happy with the job I did. And the fact my friend not only complimented specifically the ocean in the illustration, but also asked me for a tutorial on how I did it, really means a lot to me. So thank you, my dude. I hope this little video is what you imagined with your request. And for everyone else, I hope you also got a lot out of this video. Like I said, a lot of my progress is going with my gut, but especially the preparation with the mood board and style studies helped me lots with this piece. If I hadn't done those, I would have been way too lost and going with my gut wouldn't have worked as well as it did, or at all if I'm being honest. So remember to study what interests you so that you don't have to think too much while creating your own artworks. That's it for now, and if you guys have any questions or requests for future videos, please let me know. But regardless, I hope you had fun and that we see each other again in the next video. And for now, bye bye!